Hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining us at Coalesce 2020. My name is Janessa Lantz. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Fishtown Analytics. I'm actually in the Fishtown Analytics office today, so behind the scenes moment. I will be the host and moderator of this session on getting started with technical blogging. And today I'm joined by Stephanie Morillo. She's the PM content strategist. She's a published author, has a ton to say about this topic, and I'm incredibly excited to be speaking with her. And I will have her introduce herself in just a moment. All chat conversation is taking place in the Coalesce Tech blogging channel of DBT Slack. Hoping somebody can drop that link into Slack. Questions, comments, reactions should all go in that channel. Feel free to ask questions at any point during the session. I have Slack up next to me and we'll be referencing it and giving some of your questions to Stephanie as well. So please feel free to interject at any point of the session. Stephanie and I will also be joining the Slack channel after our conversation wraps to answer any additional questions. So let's get started. Stephanie, could you kick us off by telling the audience a little bit about yourself, your career, specifically why you care so much about this topic of technical blogging and think that other people should give it a try?
Sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Stephanie Morillo. I'm a technical program manager and a content strategist. By day, I am a technical program manager on a growth engineering team, but by trade, I am a content strategist with over 5 years of experience editing and writing content written by or for technical audiences, primarily software developers. Blogging is something that I have been doing for 20 years on and off, ever since I went online for the first time back in 1997. 10 years ago, I was a music blogger and covering events. And when I started learning how to code, my mentor, the person who taught me how to code, recommended that I start a blog just to start cementing my knowledge as a way of documenting my progress, as a way of trying to what I like to say is crystallize my understanding and my learning. So that's kind of how it got started, with the initial goal of becoming a software developer. But what I found was that I loved writing about the issues that I was having so much, and troubleshooting and hacking solutions, that I decided that I wanted to continue on the writing route, but I wanted to continue writing for technical audiences. So it has opened many doors. My blogging has reached a lot of different folks. I get opportunities to speak to people such as you today. As a result of my blogging, people have discovered me online without having followed me on social media because they found one of my posts via Google search. So blogging is something that I thoroughly enjoy. I enjoy sharing what I'm learning as well as what I know with audiences. I enjoy documenting my progress and meeting people as a result of the things that I write.
I love that so much. That resonates very much with my own experience of content creation. I've kind of dabbled in it throughout my career, and one of the big things for me, I mean, my career started in content marketing for companies, and one of the things for me is that I had left a job and was planning to do freelance for a little while, and wrote a blog post about some of my experiences, and it ended up getting unusual amounts of attention, and a VP of marketing at HubSpot found it, and she got in touch with me. And at the time, that was like my dream company to work for, and I was completely blown away. And like, that's the only reason that she found me, and they offered me this really fantastic job. And that was like my moment of being like, oh, content marketing doesn't just work for companies, right? Like, it can actually change the course of your career for individuals as well. So love that. Sounds like you've had some of those experiences as well. So tell us specifically, and you touched on this a little bit in your introduction, but why do you think people, particularly women, should be blogging and speaking about their work? What do you think the benefits are for individuals?
I think that it's important to have a body of work that represents your area of expertise or your chosen field, whether or not you consider yourself an expert. I think what blogging does is that it helps anyone who visits your blog understand your thought process. It helps them understand, frankly, how you communicate. Written communication is incredibly important, especially in the field of technology now, more so than I think in the past. Technologists are spending, or rather they're paying a lot of attention to their communication style, because they understand that communication is not just how you convey authority or your expertise. It's also considered a skill for leadership in your field. So having a blog, what it does is that it gives anyone who is maybe considering you for a job, or maybe they just visited your site for the first time, a little bit more background into what it is that you like, what it is that you're interested in, maybe how your career has progressed over a particular point of time, helps them understand who your audience is. Potentially, a potential employer, for example, might look at your blog, trying to understand, okay, what roles is this person interested in, what industries, that kind of thing. So you have kind of a body of work that speaks for itself. I think that the benefit about having all of this content is that it also gives you a starting point. We know that employers will search for you online. They'll look at your LinkedIn,
Yep.
they'll look for your social media. So why not give them access to your brain? Let them pick your brain without actually picking your brain, in an environment where you're the one that controls the direction of the conversation, as opposed to an interview where I think a lot of folks, we tend to feel nervous. We're not really sure what kinds of questions are going to be asked. We're not really sure how we can come up with situational, explanations to situational questions on the spot. But you can do that on a blog. And frankly, it's not unusual for individuals to reach out and say, hey, I read this blog post, and they'll link out to it. And then that is a conversation starter. So I think that what it does is it really lets you take the spotlight, and it allows you to dictate where you want, or what kinds of opportunities you want to come your way. And people can look at it at any time. So you don't have to constantly repeat yourself. It's there on your blog. You can share it with folks, whenever the moment is appropriate.
Yeah, I love that. I think that particularly thinking about the job search, it also puts you in a much better position to negotiate. It's like, uh, I don't know. If you haven't had the experience of hiring people yourself, I think there's this idea of like hiring is like this really fantastic process and everybody's super thoughtful, and that's not really true. And actually it just relies on a lot of like gut opinions, and having social proof out there of people who are already sharing your work and commenting on your work is so validating. Again, particularly when you're thinking about women or people of color, right, who are often showing up in interviews, and maybe their professional accomplishments are being viewed in a slightly different light. And it's like you have this body of work and it's been validated by other people. And suddenly you're just in a much stronger position. So it is very much about this like, is your like, where do you want the conversation to start? Right. And like you get to control the narrative of your career.
Yeah, 100%. I think as a result of blogging, I've built up a brand. You build up a brand. I
Yeah.
know that a lot of technologists, feel there's a lot of tension with the word branding, or personal
Yeah.
branding, right? Because
Yeah.
it relates to a person. But frankly, when somebody finds me online, they associate me with certain things: technical writing, developer content, a host of these, like, interrelated fields. I'm known for talking about developer relations. I'm known
Yeah.
for a host of different things. And all of that is reflected in my blog. And that's nice, because what it does is that it allows me to, I get to present myself the way that I want to. Now, here's the thing: I don't write about topics that I don't like, or things that I don't consider myself a subject matter expert in, or even something that I don't necessarily is not related enough to my field that I won't even start dabbling in it. So
Mm.
I made the decision early on about what my niche was, where my area was, what I wanted to focus on was, and then everything, all of my body of work currently reflects that. So, I mean, I had blog posts related to a host of other things, but I realized that that wasn't really the way I wanted to present myself now. So I removed them. And then I start writing about, topics that either folks in the community are interested in, or I'm interested in, or think they would be interested in, but maybe they didn't think to ask. And then I start writing about that. So as a result, I'm now in a position where when opportunities come my way, they tend to be more relevant and more qualified opportunities than if I were just promoting myself as a general content strategist,
Yes.
or general technical program manager, without specifying exactly where what my focus area was.
So, Stephanie, you're setting me up for my next question and kind of moving into that zone, which is how do you pick themes and topics to write about? And I think maybe more specifically, based on what you're saying, is like how do you find like the topic bunch that you want to write about, right? Because you don't, it's not actually good to just like write 10 blog posts about like 10 random things. How do you find like your
Yeah.
zone?
So the first thing is you have to hone in on what your area is. So if you know you're going to write about data engineering, then maybe you don't want to write about hardware or something like that,
Right.
you're going to connect the two in a way that might not be self-evident to the reader. So that's the first thing is decide like what the broad area and category is that you want to focus on. And then there are 4 ways of generating ideas. The first one is to come up with a list of topics of things that you already know. And by the way, there's a lot of things that we think are really obvious that are not obvious. And I'll give you an example. I wrote a book on content creation for developers. A year ago, when I started thinking about writing this book, I thought there was going to be no audience for this book. I thought that this book was so foundational and so 101 that everyone would laugh at me if I brought it out. I thought that this was like common knowledge because I'm someone who has been in the field for a significant amount of time. I've built my entire career in communications, marketing, and content. So a lot of the stuff that for me felt foundational, I assumed that it would be true for my audience. So if there are things that seem very 101 level to you, those are the kinds of things you write in that category. Things that you know. That's one area. Another stream for generating ideas is to write a list of things you want to learn, things you want to learn about. I'll give you an example. I recently wrote a blog post that was like an explainer of web analytics. So anyone who has Google Analytics or various privacy-focused analytics platforms on their blog or personal site, I wanted to write about it because I work on a program where we leverage web analytics for experimentation. I run an A/B testing program. So web analytics is really important. I wanted to understand how it works, how data was collected, how cookies work, et cetera, et cetera. So it really was a way for me to understand what it was it was a way for me to crystallize my understanding and then hopefully teach others who were interested or weren't even sure that they should pay attention to this, but it started because I wanted to learn more about it. So that was another area. The third way of generating content is to repurpose what you have. Maybe you've given talks before, maybe you've given a conference talk before, maybe you gave a meetup before, maybe you gave a presentation, maybe you spoke on a podcast, maybe you wrote a blog post 5 years ago about something. You can reuse and refresh the content you have already created in different forms and turn that into another piece of content. We don't always have to generate net new content every time. I think one concern that I've seen a lot of technologists have is that I have to come up with a net new piece of content every single time, and it has to be a novel idea that someone has never thought about before. Absolutely not. If you've already created something, think about what you can extract from it. Maybe you can update it. Maybe you can expand on a particular point. I mean, when I was the editor-in-chief of the DigitalOcean blog, one of the VP of engineering at the time actually gave a talk about building remote engineering teams. And it was a really, really long talk. He gave me his notes, and I actually extracted a third of his notes and turned that into a blog post on the blog. It was all focused on one particular thing. I scoped it and then I turned it into a blog post. I've turned my own conference talks into blog posts. And that's great because it means that you can present this information in a new way. Remember, not everyone will consume information the same way. So just because you gave a talk and it's a recording doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to consume it that way. So that's another idea. And then finally, the fourth way of generating content ideas is to see what people want to know. So if you're heavily involved in communities, if people come to you with questions, or if you see folks in different forums or mailing lists or what have you, Twitter, asking questions about a particular area that maybe you have some knowledge about, turn their questions or their pain points into a blog post. And you know that immediately you have at least one person who would be the audience for this. So I've done, I think, 2 or 3 blog posts on my blog this year that started out as questions that I got over email from people. How do I do this? How do I write for different audiences? What's the right word count? And then I turned that into a blog post and made that readily available to everyone else. So the thing here is the expectation is not that you have to sit down and just wait for the muses to bestow upon you a bunch of ideas. They're actually areas that, these 4 areas we've already used in some way, shape, or form in the past. And it's just about tapping into them. And whenever an idea strikes, write that down. There are no good or bad ideas in the beginning. There's just ideas. Once you get used to generating ideas, I think that'll help speed up the rest of the writing process.
Yeah, and I in my experience, I've worked with a lot of professionals who are trying to write more about their work, not people for whom this is their full-time job. And it's like there are two really common mistakes that you touched on. One is the importance of 101 content. Like, don't try to be overly clever. the specific is always more interesting than the general, right? So it's like, it's always better to pick a super narrow topic where you can go really, really deep than to try to say something thoughtful about like a whole industry. Like, leave that to
Yeah.
the VPs, right? Like, you don't
Yeah.
have the perspective to write that post. Go deep, and that's just like always more interesting. The other one that you touched on that I love and is such freaking good advice is write for one person. And you're talking about that literally, like if you get a question right for one person. But this is the feedback I find myself giving again and again to new writers is it's like, who is the one person who you are excited to send this blog post to? Like, you want to publish it because you're going to send it to your friend and they're going to think it's great. And like, if you don't have that person, it's just it's just too general, right?
Mhm.
It's not interesting. You need to go back to the drawing board. If you can get to that where you're just like, this is a letter that I'm writing to myself of 2 years ago, or that I'm writing to Sarah, who I met at a conference last week, like that's where you get to the good stuff. And people always think that when I give that advice, I'm talking about personas, right? They're like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm writing for one person. It's an analyst. And I'm like, no, no, no. Like, I want a name. Like, send me their LinkedIn profile, right? Then they're
Yeah. Yeah.
and so this idea of saying like, if you get a question, write the blog post, is like so useful. I love that.
Awesome. Yeah, it's the writing for a target audience or having a reader in mind. To your point, it's always helpful when you can envision that person, when there's an actual person you
Yes.
have in mind. So it's not just an analyst. It might be a junior person on your team. It might
Yep.
be your mentee. I wrote the web analytics blog post with my husband in mind. I was like, I want someone who doesn't understand anything
Yeah.
about the web to read this and to say, wow, this is interesting. So I wrote it from that perspective, which helped because as writers, we make assumption about our audience, what we think they want, what we think they need to know. That's built in. That's how we write because we can't write for everyone. So we make
Yeah.
these assumptions as we write. But if you're going to make those assumptions, you have to make sure that the assumptions are more or less not that they're as precise as possible. And the way to get that is by having a person in mind. And that person you can call certain characteristics. You can say, these are things that this person knows. These are things that this person doesn't know. This is a pain point this person has. This is a scenario in which they have hit a roadblock, which this blog post will answer. So yeah, I love that advice. I think that it's important to really have an actual person in mind that you feel like you're talking to as you're writing this.
Yep. And it's a shortcut, right? Like, once you're more advanced, come up with a persona and get fancy and do your keyword research. But like, when you're just getting started, that is the hack. Stephanie, we have a question from the audience that I'm gonna send your way. This is Barry Hart from MailChimp. He's saying, my employer has a company engineering blog, and if it's a MailChimp engineering blog, it's probably pretty good. Any thoughts on whether it's better to start blogging on the company blog or just start blogging on your own? I like that question.
That
I think that's a good thing to
That's a
think about.
really no, that's a really, really good question. I think that there are benefits to both. So, and I think it really depends on what the goal of the Mailchimp engineering blog is. So, there are a few, and I don't know how this particular blog operates. A few engineering blogs may or may not have any kind of technical review process or editorial process. If it does, I recommend going that route because it's really helpful to work with editors or have a peer review your work prior to going live. I
Yes.
think that is a gap that I find in a lot of content created by technologists. They spend a lot of time in ramping up, so the drafting phase. And once they get everything out, maybe they'll look it over real quick and then publish. I think that working with an editor or someone else gives you that reader's perspective, which as writers we don't always have because we are writing with the goal of trying to get everything in our head onto paper. But it's nice when an objective third party can look at your content with the eyes of a reader and say, hey, I think that this is missing something, I think, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for that reason, it's beneficial. Secondly, I think it's great for moving up in the company. You can
Yep.
show, I created a blog post. This blog post got X amount of views. It's great for your brand because chances are if it gets published on the engineering blog, it'll get shared to social. The marketing team may share it in a newsletter. So you have the company's marketing engine behind you promoting that content. And I think that it lends a sense of reputation building, right? You have like the validation of knowing that your company thought that this particular blog was worthwhile. So I think that I think that if you have that option available to you, I highly recommend it. In fact, I think more engineers should write for their company engineering blogs. I see the opposite problem. The problem is that a company starts an engineering blog and engineers are either too shy to write for them or not really sure what to write about. So if you have something in mind that you think would be a great fit for that engineering blog, do it. But nothing is stopping you, by the way, from writing on your personal blog. So if your engineering blog has certain criteria and you have a blog post in mind that meets that particular criteria, there's no harm absolutely at all in publishing it on the engineering blog. But then maybe topics that you want to explore that are kind of out of scope for the engineering blog, you can publish on your personal blog. I recommend doing both. I think it's really good for engineers to do that. And I think if you do it, other engineers on your team may also feel they may also feel encouraged to start writing for the engineering blog. So I think it's a win-win either way.
Yeah. I think that advice, like, or those maybe two questions, like, do you have editorial support? Do you have promotional support? Can also be expanded to really any other platform. Medium is a little bit less popular today than it was a few years ago. This was a question I used to get a lot. It's like, should I publish in a Medium publication? But it's also like, should I try to get a column in like Forbes or Entrepreneur? And like all that stuff to me comes down to those two questions. Like, do you get editorial support and are they going to promote your work? If they are, it's beneficial to align with a publication. If they're not, you're still doing all the work anyway. It's just sort of like additional headache and you lose ownership of your work. But if you can find a good editor to work with, don't pass that up.
I agree.
In my opinion,
Yeah.
like totally worth having your work live on the company blog. And you can always like repost it and do that stuff as well if you want to maintain some amounts of ownership. Awesome question. Okay, so here is the sticky one. It's like, I mean, how many times has somebody told you that they are committed to blogging? Right, like we're heading into New Year resolution season and everybody's going to be like, I'm going to write more. So probably half the people on this talk today have already made this internal commitment. How do you actually stick to it? How do you make time in your schedule?
So how do you make time in your schedule? I recommend working in time boxes. So for any of you who are familiar with the Scrum framework, you are probably familiar with the concept of a time box, which is an agreed upon maximum amount of time that you are going to work on something. What I would recommend is working in time boxes of 20 to 30 minutes because I find that it's easier to find 20 to 30 minute blocks in your schedule than an hour, but it's also long enough that you actually make some progress. So schedule 20 to 30 minutes throughout your week, wherever it is that you find that opening, and then set your timer and write and sit down and write for those 20 to 30 minutes. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that the writing process, I find, is actually 3 or more stages. You have the research phase or the ideation phase, which is the pre-work stage. This is where you're trying to find resources. This is where you're doing some research. This is where you're maybe outlining some of your ideas. This is maybe where you're trying to find what it is that you want to write about. That's one stage. Then you have the actual drafting stage, which is, okay, I have all of this information now. I'm going to synthesize this information and get all of my ideas down on paper. That is the drafting stage. That is what we call the writing stage. And then you have the editing stage, which is the stage where you're actually refactoring what you're doing. You're reviewing what you wrote, you're getting it published ready, you're making it more clear, more concise, you're editing for grammar, those kinds of things. So you can schedule time boxes for these activities. So I recommend when you schedule a time box on your calendar, you can say research for half an hour on Monday, and then maybe Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday are going to be drafting or writing, and then maybe Sunday you're going to work on editing. I find that tends to help. We don't have to do sit down like some writers do. And I mean, writers like Nobel Prize winning authors who sit down for hours at a time. They wake up at 4 a.m. and they write for 4 hours.
It's always 4 a.m. Very important.
Yeah.
Always 4 a.m.
You don't have to do that. All you have to do is find a certain amount of block of time that commits and write up until that time is up. And then you can start moving that around as your schedule allows. It allows for a lot of flexibility, but you feel like you got something done, because if you know that the timer hit 30 minutes and you're able to get a few hundred words in, maybe less, at least you know that for that half hour, you got something done. And the more you do that, I find that the more you give yourself those kinds of wins, the more you are able to create some kind of consistency, because you want to keep it up. You see that it works. Yep. So, and you know that you don't have to do it within a certain time frame. It doesn't have to be the same time every day. It's just, I have 30 minutes during this time and that's when I'm going to do it, then you start building some kind of consistency. So I recommend starting with time boxes.
That's really good advice. Folks in the channel are asking about mediums to publish, like LinkedIn or Medium, and I want to answer that question kind of in context of what you're saying, Stephanie, about time boxing. Is that one of the things that I think is really important with this work is recognizing your own motivational levers, and like the thing that gets people to continue this habit is feedback from other people. And to me, that is the great thing about LinkedIn is like set 20 minutes and just write a freaking tiny LinkedIn update. It like doesn't like that forces you to get something into the world, and like within 2 hours you will have likes and you'll be like, "Oh my god, 500 people read this." And you start to motivate yourself. So like get those quick wins for yourself. Like do 30 minutes of writing and just get yourself to publish. And that to me is what's great about Medium as well, is it's just like so easy. You don't have to set or Substack, honestly, but it's like you don't have to set up anything. Just get some ideas into the world and start getting that little bit of positive feedback, and that will start to motivate you to do more.
Yeah, I have my perspective on where to blog is a little bit different. I'm a big fan of owning your own content.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is we see, and you mentioned this earlier, Medium was hugely popular a few years ago, and it kind of slowed down in popularity. I think it's very easy to get too hung up on the platform. And I like having a place where your full body of work can live. You can repost it, you can republish it in other areas. But I think it's really important to have a personal blog. Now, I mean, I know that with software engineers, for example, static site generators are all the rage. They love Gatsby, they love Jekyll, they love Hugo, they love all of these different SSGs. But you don't even have to start something like that. If you do choose to start a Medium blog, make that your place. You can create a blog on Squarespace. You can create a blog on Wix. My entire site is built on Wix, on a premium plan, but it's on Wix. And it's all drag and drop capability. I love it. It's all drag and drop capability. I don't have to maintain or provision any servers or harden anything or, use Git hooks or anything, very fancy. I can just go in, log in and publish. So if you're wondering where it is you should get started, look at some of the different blogging platforms out there and try to and think through pros or cons. You want a blog platform that you can grow with over time. But remember, you can always republish your stuff elsewhere in the future. And after the session, I'll post some links in the Slack channel to talk a little bit more about syndicating your content. But if you're just trying to get started, sure, then do it on LinkedIn, publish your stuff on Medium, and then maybe when you start a personal blog, republish those things on your personal blog, et cetera, so that if somebody is looking for you online, they will find your blog and they'll know, your full body of work.
Yeah, I agree. You definitely want to own your work. My stance is like the sooner you can accept that your first like 5 to 10 blog posts are just going to be crap, like the faster you can just like get them out and move on.
Yeah.
Like, you just have to do some cycles. Don't
You
get
do.
precious about where they're kept, right? Like in 10 years, you're not going to be like, oh, that great third blog post that I wrote. But then own your work as it starts getting good, and yeah, you want to have that. Okay. Common mistakes and pitfalls. What do you see people doing wrong?
Ooh, what do I see? What do I see people doing wrong? So a few weeks ago, this might have been in October, I asked my Twitter followers, what are some missing pieces of content in technical blog posts? So if we're talking about technical content where you are sharing or you're explaining something to an audience in the hopes that they will be able to do or learn something, some common pitfalls I've seen are individuals not including like a list of dependencies, libraries, or version numbers. This is really important because if a lot of folks are headed to Google as their first place for finding content on how to do something, they need to know exactly what your environment looked like when you were creating that post. So you have to be very specific about all of and list all of that information out. That's one thing. So add dependencies, libraries, version numbers. 2, a list of prerequisites. So if you think about technical content almost like a recipe, so think about like Sunbasket or Blue Apron or any of these recipe companies, they will send you a little recipe card and it'll tell you the list of ingredients that you need. Maybe if like what kinds of tools you're going to need, right? Like what kinds of kitchen equipment you're going to need in order to get started. That's what the prerequisites are. The prerequisites are a list of things that users should know should have or do before they look at your blog post. So if you think that this blog post is a more intermediate or advanced level, you might want to specify that. You might want to let users know what the step before it was so that they have sufficient context in order to follow your material.
That is
Other
that is such good advice. Think about your technical blog post like a recipe. Like that is
Yeah,
such good advice.
it's almost perfect in every way. It's almost
Yeah.
uncanny because recipes tend to be short and concise. They tend to be very precise, and they tend to follow a logical pattern. So after you do this, then you have to do that, then you have to do that. They tell you what the end state is, and they show you what the end state is, and then they break it down into all of the different individual parts, and they try to walk you through the process of actually doing that or creating that recipe. So when you think about like tutorials, things that are step-by-step guides that show you how to build, create something step by step, you have to think about it like a recipe. You want the experience for the reader to be as frictionless as possible. So you don't want them to get to step 3 and then realize that there was a missing step between step 3 and what you're calling step 4. Maybe there actually was something in the middle there that was
Yep.
missing. So I recommend that after you create blog posts, do it from scratch, read it from scratch, take a few days away from it, come back to it with fresh eyes, and follow the steps from scratch to see if there were areas that were vague, areas that were confusing, areas that hadn't been fleshed out sufficiently that were going to cause some confusion for the reader. So that's another common pitfall I see. And I will also see things like accessibility, like writers not adding alt text to images, screenshots, diagrams. Like a lot of blog posts use screenshots of code snippets. They may have screenshots of any other kind of material. Add descriptions to your alt text that allows individuals who are using screen readers in order to read your blog post to know what is in that image. A screen reader cannot read an image. So if there's an image and it shows a diagram and you're showing something that is really important for the person who is reading this blog post, you want to make sure that you have a description of what's actually in there so that individuals who rely on assistive technology can actually access that material. So those are just a few that I can think of off the top of my head.
So Grant is in the comments saying, make sure it's not one of those recipe blogs where there are 8 paragraphs about picking up the kids from soccer practice before the ingredients list. But I
No.
actually think technical bloggers could learn a little bit from this, which is that whenever people are presenting a how-to, it often lacks the why,
Yes.
right? Like it lacks context, right? So like what is going on in your business that makes this valuable? Like what is your thought process you get in? So yeah, not 8 paragraphs, but I think that that's an important part of what you're describing, Stephanie, is like helping people understand why you're making the decisions that you're making as well.
You have to, yeah, you want an introduction even to those kinds of blog posts because you have to set the background. You have to set what the problem is. And this is actually the place, the introduction is where you state what the problem is, what the scenario is. And this is where you tell readers what the takeaways of that blog post is. So it shouldn't just be,
Yep.
How to do this, then the third on Ubuntu 2004, and then you just go into the steps. So why is this important? What's the use case? What is it about this particular technology that I need to know prior to following all of these steps? So you want to have like a short introduction, can be 2 or 3 paragraphs. And again, you want to make sure that you state what the key points and takeaways are for the reader. And then you go into your prerequisites and all of the dependencies, and then your step-by-step before you conclude. But that context is actually necessary in a lot of technical blog posts. Otherwise, you're reading an article and you're not really quite sure why or what you would need this for, unless the writer tells you.
Yep. Okay. One of the things that I think is scary about speaking or writing is that you are putting yourself out there and exposing yourself to being told that you're wrong. So talk us through that. I would love to hear the meanest comment that you ever got about your content and kind of how you dealt with that. And also the nicest comment, like comments that kind of motivated you to keep going, and comments that were extremely discouraging.
Maybe this is a good thing, but I don't remember what the meanest comment
That's
I've ever
great.
gotten was. I mean, it's not that everyone agrees with me, But I don't generally get mean comments. If anything, I will get folks who are, who will share their approaches, or, like, I disagree. This is what, what I found works. And I welcome those conversations, because the point is, I find that there's always more than one way to do something. And if a different approach has worked for someone else, I want to hear about it. I want to learn more about it. I want to understand their use case. But the frankly, the ones that stand out for me are the positive ones. It's the ones that, when I wake up on Twitter and people will say, I'm almost scared at how you described your audience for this blog post, Stephanie. This is exactly me. Or
Yeah.
in YouTube, for example, I recently gave a conference talk on marketing for software developers. And I know YouTube comments tend to be kind of scary, but the YouTube comment that I got for that one was, for the recording, was something like, I actually watched this talk twice, and I had my notebook out and I wrote a lot of notes, and all of your tips, thank you so much. And I responded to them. What I like to do is I welcome the conversation. So I will respond to comments. I'm fortunate enough that I don't get people that are super, super heated about it. But even if they are, I ask them to tell me more. Tell me more about that. Just to give them a chance to kind of, separate whatever, their feelings are from, their actual thought process.
Yeah. So like, don't try
Um,
to defend it. Invite them to give
invite them in.
context. Yeah.
Yeah, invite them in. And I find that in those exchanges, like exchanges where, like if I publish a blog post and somebody leaves me like 4 or 5 comments, the more I start conversing with the person, you find toward the end, they really appreciate that you took the time to do that, because a lot of people don't expect that. They don't expect engagement with blog writers, at least at that level. I always try to respond to people in the way I would want people to respond to me. And I find that that approach has worked very well. Now, again, your mileage may vary. It really depends on frankly, on the kind of content that you're creating, and generally how audiences work in that particular space. But if you make it a point to engage your audience, you'll find at the end people are really grateful, even for just having hashed it out. You learn something new, they learn something new, and it ends up being a win-win for everyone. And then people who read the exchange are like, oh, that's really cool. Look at how so and so responded, and like what the conclusion of that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. So you don't have to get too hung up on defending your stance. Maybe just encourage them to
I
defend
just
theirs.
tell me more. Yep. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
tell me more
That's
about
good.
that.
It's really great advice. So two questions that we have from the audience around barriers. One is stuck in perpetual research phase. How do I get past
Mhm.
that? The other one is the problem of perfectionism, which I think is incredibly common, right? Where it's like people will fuss over the perfect title or
Oh,
the
man.
perfect conclusion. How do you get past those two things? Too much research, too much perfectionism.
I give myself deadlines. So my goal is to publish a blog post per month. And I know that if I'm working on a blog post, that no matter what happens, I have to hit my blog post per month. That is an artificial and an arbitrary cadence, but it's one that works for me, because what it does is that it puts some pressure and tells me, it's me telling myself, it's that voice in my head telling me, you can't just sit around with this idea floating through your head forever and writing research and putting something out. If you're stuck in the perpetual research phase, chances are you probably had some level of scope creep. So you might want to go back and say, first, it
Yes.
helps to start with a very specific goal. What exactly will the reader learn, do, or understand about this thing? And then as you start researching, if you find that you're kind of like going a little too deep down a rabbit hole here, you got to reel it back. Like, is this something that's actually going to take away from this particular post, or is this something that is necessary in order for me to make sure that the reader achieves my intended goal? So if you're spending
Yeah.
a bunch of time researching, chances are you actually completely blew past what the goal was. So start by being very specific about not just what the topic is, but what the outcome of that particular goal is. And then, write it down, have it on a sticky note somewhere. And when you're writing and you're researching, you're constantly revisiting what that goal is to make sure that you're within scope.
Can I
With
add to that?
Yes.
One of the things to keep in mind around scope is people often ask this question around word count, which like doesn't matter. Honestly, you can write however many words that you want to write as long as you have interesting words to say.
Yes.
But like in general, once you're past 1,500 words, it's time to start asking yourself if this is 2 blog posts. Not because it
Yeah.
actually matters, it just like makes it easier for you as the writer to actually hit publish on something. And so that's always like a warning sign. It's like people are saying, how long should my blog post be? Truly doesn't matter. But 1,500 words is a really good indicator. You know, as you venture above that into 5,000 word territory, you have a lot to say about this topic. Think about a series, right? Like get to one
Yes.
post.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. At that point, you've probably gone beyond the scope of what your intended, your original
Yes.
goal was. I'm also team, it doesn't matter necessarily how many words, as long as you are very clear that everything that's in there is something that is related to the scope of the post and isn't and doesn't go beyond that. But yeah, I think 1,500 words is a good starting point if you just need some kind of arbitrary number to help you start questioning to at least, if you hit 1,500 words, that is the point where you stop and you review your content, you revisit your content to make sure that you're still on track, or if you have more there than is necessary, only because of the way people read online. We don't read word for
Yeah.
word the way we read a physical book. Lots of studies have been done about this. We skim and we scan. We look for keywords, we look for breaks in the content, we look for phrases, we look for things that will help us understand whether or not the content is relevant enough, and that we can kind of pull as needed. So if you're writing something that is kind of, very prosy and there's like lots of paragraphs and blah, 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 then, you're probably doing a lot more than your audience, frankly, has the attention span for, because all of us have
Yeah.
very short attention. All of us, we all have
Yes.
short attention spans
Yeah.
when we're in front of a screen.
Use
That is
more
not,
use keep using those line breaks, right? Like
yes,
this is not the Paris review. Nobody
yes,
is going to read
line
your
breaks,
paragraph.
bulleted lists. Instead of writing paragraphs
Yeah.
with tons of phrases, with a bunch of commas, break that down into a bulleted list. Introduce your sections with section headers, bold
Yes.
phrases or words that you want to stand out, call out if it's calling out a particular, something that you think is important for the audience to read. But those kinds of things are important for readers who read online content.
Agree, agree. Stephanie, what is your hottest of hot takes on content creation? What is the thing, or maybe the thing that you find yourself disagreeing with people the most? What is, you know, what do you need to say to us?
The thing that I find disagreeing with people the most, I mean, I have very strong opinions about blog platforms, because I think, only because I work primarily in the software developer space, and I find that, people feel that if you don't build your blog from scratch, that it's somehow not, that it's not that like, you have to be one of the cool kids. You have to use one of the
Right,
site
right.
generators everybody else is using, and I'm just like, no, you don't. You can
Yeah,
literally, spin up a WordPress.com site and write on WordPress.com. The platform does not matter as much as the content
that's the
on it.
content. Yeah.
It's the
So,
content.
what are your thoughts on the newest hot thing and content, which is Substack?
Well, I think Substack is great for Substack. I don't think it's
Yeah.
necessary. It doesn't scale very well for writers,
Okay.
for a few reasons. So I like, the newslettery format and the format for readability, as opposed to, the focus on like multimedia images and stuff like that. It's really nice. It looks very nice. I started my newsletter on Substack earlier in the year, and I found that Substack's analytics were very subpar. You can't do if you want to do something. Here's the thing. If you're trying to do your mailing list for more than just getting a newsletter out every now and again, Substack, I don't find scales very well. So if you want a mailing list because you're trying to build a business, a consultancy, you can't do things like segmentation. You can't do A/B testing on Substack. And frankly, even the ability to charge people for Substack, they take a huge cut, a huge percentage of whatever it is that you're trying to charge. So I find that it's better to use marketing automation platform like ConvertKit or MailChimp. Doesn't really matter which, but a particular platform that specializes in email, which allows you to scale your list. You can segment, you can send out different kinds of content to different segments depending on how you build your segments. So I think that here's the thing about places like Substack and Medium and those kinds of places. they have a lot of, they rank very high in search. They rank very high in search and they keep people on the platform. So not only are people reading your content, but chances are they can go onto Substack's main page and find other content, which is great. It's awesome. If what you want first and foremost is to improve your discoverability and findability, Substack is a great platform. But if you really if you want to scale, I think that after a certain point, moving off of Substack is going to be necessary. I stayed with Substack until I hit about 100 subscribers. And then I migrated off of Substack and I moved my entire mailing list over to MailChimp earlier this year. Now I'm at 1,500 and I have something like 10 segments and a bunch of other stuff. So it allows me to send different people different types of content depending on their interests, or if they bought an ebook or if they signed up for a webinar, which I find very valuable. But if you want to get started, frankly, Substack is great. I started on a Substack because I wanted to keep myself accountable. So I created a Substack newsletter and I would publish every 2 weeks. And it ended up really, really good for me. It's just that my own needs changed over time. So if your needs change over time and you find that the platform is not meeting those needs, don't be afraid of migrating over somewhere else. But it doesn't matter if you get started there. If what it will do is help you remain consistent. And maybe that's where you learn more about email marketing and how that works.
Yeah, that's great. So I am going to ask you one more question and then we will wrap up. A lot of folks on this call are people who want to write and speak more. What is one thing that they should do this week to ensure that they publish a blog post in January of 2021?
Set an arbitrary deadline. So tell yourself, I am publishing a blog post by December 31st. And start documenting the process of you actually writing this blog post. Learning in public is a huge thing on Twitter, I find, where people start documenting their progress and how they're working through things and what they're learning as they're building, as they're growing. And having, even if you feel like no one is necessarily looking, it's nice having accountability. It's nice to see, just have that accountability, right? You're saying, okay, I'm building this thing, so now I have to build it. So now in your head, you're saying, okay, now I have to write this blog post. So creating those kinds of, I wouldn't say triggers, but those kinds of mechanisms to help you feel the pressure a little bit is very helpful.
Yeah.
So set an arbitrary deadline, tell people that you're working on this thing. And you find that for a lot of folks that ends up being a huge motivator. And then start with the time boxes. Set up time boxes today on your schedule, 20 to 30 minutes to start writing.
Awesome. And if you are attending this session and at this conference, you probably have things to write about data. So like, obviously, let us know. The DBT blog is a platform that is open to all of you. If you want to commit to writing a post next year, please get in touch with me. I'm hanging out in Slack for this entire conference. Stephanie, anything else you want to add before we wrap up today?
So I will put this in the Slack, but I do have a special discount for folks who are following the session for my book, The Developer's Guide to Content Creation. It's been purchased by over 1,100 developers as of this morning. And I have a 10% discount and I will add that in the Slack channel shortly. So I'm really excited.
That's great. Awesome. Recommendation on Stephanie's book. This is Claire and I have both read this. This is actually how we found Stephanie for the conference, is because we were doing some reading together on technical blogging. So highly recommend. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us today. Really telling people that they should be creating content and writing and speaking about their work is really one of my personal favorite things to harp on about. So it was nice to have somebody join me in this conversation who really agrees with that position.